Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph, an organizational behavior scholar, continuing my interest in leadership. And we are talking about the role of emotional intelligence in leadership. And emotional intelligence has 4 domains: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And today we're continuing our exploration of self-awareness with the idea of what makes us feel safe and social. And I'm really intrigued by this because of our natural negativity bias as humans, and we have this bias in order to keep ourselves alive and safe, even if the risks to us are no longer saber-toothed tigers or other animals that were around when we first developed our lower brainstem functions. We tend to overlook or underweight positive experiences and the things that help us feel good. And I think we do so at our peril when we are trying to be a good self-leader, leader of our teams, and leader within our organizations. So I want to talk about a few stories about the value of what I'll come to call glimmers, which are people, places, and situations that do help us feel safe and social. When I graduated from college, one of my first jobs was working at the Institute for the Study of Smoking Behavior and Policy. And listeners to this podcast may remember a story from before. But on my very first day at the Institute, I was invited to a research meeting, and everybody was sitting around the conference table talking about smoking cessation or something like that, which was the type of thing we studied there. And the director of the Institute, John Pinney, turned to me and said, "Well, Jenny, what do you think about that?" And I literally froze. And I looked around the room and I thought to myself, who the hell cares what I think about that? I'm like the new research assistant. I don't know anything about smoking cessation. So I took a deep breath and I said, well, what do you mean? What do you want to know? And he said, well, you haven't thought about this before, and I think you might have kind of a fresh perspective on what we're looking at. And once I got over my shock at being asked for my opinion in this situation, I shared it. Why I mention this is quickly because of the tendency of John, the Institute director, and one of my bosses, Jan, to frequently stop by my cubicle and talk with me and chat about my opinions. I started developing this sense of belonging, and I started feeling kind of safe and like I could share my opinions in this situation. And I realized over time that one of the most important things we can give each other that helps us feel safe and social is the sense that your opinion matters and that what you think can contribute to the situation. I didn't really think about this more for probably 10 years until I had been appointed the CEO of a small public policy consulting firm called Bowtech Analysis Corporation by Mark Kleiman, a professor that I had been working with at the Kennedy School of Government. And as the underqualified CEO of this small public policy consulting firm, I realized I really needed help in kind of figuring out how to be more of a visionary leader, and what did I care about and what did I want to do and how could I lead people better? And in my effort to find that out, I stumbled upon a very cool course called Hooking into Your Life Purpose, led by Charles Perry a performance consultant for organizations, and Patricia Danielson, who helped invent something called photo reading. And in interviewing me as to whether I should be in this course or not, I had this profound experience with Charles of him asking me questions and listening, I won't say with rapt attention, but with careful attention in a way that made me think more deeply, made me align what I was excited about with what I was thinking, but also what I was fearful of. And I was thinking in a way that had not really happened for me before. And again, I had this experience of somehow listening was really important to me in feeling like I mattered. And I realized that this, once again, was some sort of important managerial or leadership capability, this listening capability. In a completely different domain, when I was younger, I was fortunate enough to have parents who could send me to tennis camp. And for a couple of summers, I went to Windridge Tennis Camp in Craftsbury Common, Vermont. And the first summer that I got there, again, I felt really nervous. I didn't think I was a very good tennis player. I watched the other kids on the court who all seemed to be way, way better than I was. And again, I had this feeling of not really necessarily belonging. Until on the second or third day of camp, I stepped onto the court with one of my counselors, I'll call him Jim, and he started hitting me balls, just short ones. I was up at the service line, and he just had me hit him back, hit him back, hit him back. Gradually had me move back toward the baseline. And all of a sudden, he was hitting me these really hard topspin balls across the court, and I was returning them. And again, I had this feeling of being seen, of being understood, of like somebody giving me exactly the right challenge for me. So I note that an important resource for me as a leader and as a colleague is being in those situations, trying to cultivate those situations, trying to find those situations where people can kind of meet me where I am, where I can feel heard and seen. So our readiness goal for you this week is to start discovering or to continue enriching your understanding of what are those situations, what are those people, what are those places that help you feel what we're going to call safe and social. So be ready to notice people, places, and things that help you feel safe and social. One of the foundational things that we tend to worry about as humans is, am I safe? And we've spoken quite a bit about psychological safety. And what I'd like to talk about today is how we move up and down a ladder of neuroception, which is a fancy word for how we detect whether we feel safe or not safe. And I'm going to build on the work of Stephen Porges and Deb Dana, who have used a theory called polyvagal theory. There are certain controversial aspects of this theory which have to do with the exact physiological bases of it. But whether you buy into the vagus nerve as the driver of all these different states, there is a raft of other parallel and related work that suggests our parasympathetic nervous system and other things can help us feel calm, cool, collected, or calm, warm, and connected, what Deb Dana calls safe and social. And Deb Dana is a licensed clinical social worker who does a lot of work in the therapy realm, thinking about having people who have experienced trauma tap into resources that help them recover from trauma, toggle between scared and traumatized states and more resourceful states. And she's helped us think a lot through a process she calls the rhythm of regulation, how we can all use that in daily life to feel more connected, to recognize when we feel highly activated, when fight, flight, or freeze might be happening, and how do we return to more safe and social states. So the second thing that Steve Porges and Deb Dana talk about is the activated middle realm, and that is often associated with our sympathetic nervous system. And that's when we're ready in a good way, or we're ready in a way to get away from danger. I guess they both could be good in certain ways. So this is fight or flight, but it could also be a positive mobilized state. So a psychophysiologist named Gary Bernson and Steve Porges and others have studied the fact that we can feel highly activated as you might if you were in the starting blocks of a sprint on a track, or you might feel highly activated as you would if you were a violinist walking out onto stage at the beginning of your concert. Or you might feel highly activated as you might if you were stepping out to give a TED Talk. In these situations, your heart rate is a little higher, your blood pressure is a little higher, but you are not frightened in an overwhelmed way. You are not ready to attack in an overwhelmed way. Rather, it's a positive state of stress, sometimes captured as the tip of the inverted U in the Yerkes-Dodson curve. So a little bit of stress helps us perform better. However, too much stress can make us shut down. And that is the bottom of the ladder in the metaphorical ladder that Deb Dana talks about. And that is associated with freezing. So rather than being mobilized and ready to take action and run away from something dangerous, or mobilized and ready to take action and sprint the 200-meter race, you're so overwhelmed that you might dissociate. You might actually faint. If you're a possum, you might famously play dead. And so what we want to think about as leaders is what are the states that can make us feel overwhelmed? What are the states that make us want to flee or fight? What are the states that what are the conditions that positively activate us? And what are the conditions, situations, people, and places that make us feel safe and social? So the reason this is important for us as leaders is self-awareness of these things is the foundation of our ability to self-regulate. And to self-regulate allows us to connect, perceive, and notice what's happening with other people in a more, I'm going to use the dangerous word, accurate way. And I'm calling it dangerous because all of our perceptions are biased in certain ways or informed in certain ways. But if you're completely flooded with emotion or you're completely triggered, you are less likely to be able to detect and correct your perceptions of other people. So when we are aware of these glimmers, part of the power of them is they let us do our better work. They allow us to tap into our A game. So these positive states are not only important in themselves in a way that I will talk about in a moment, because they provide a wellspring, because they provide a refuge for us, but they potentiate our ability to do our best work, to bring our A game. And this comes from the University of North Carolina professor Barbara Fredrickson's work on the role of positive emotions in a process she calls broaden and build. And what Professor Fredrickson studied and discovered was that when we experience positive emotions, our literal neurology has more connections. There are more link ups in our brain that allow us to make more creative associations. Our attention can be stronger and more focused. Combining attention and that sort of neurological associations, we can be more creative. And we are also more open to others. So that calm, creativity, connectedness is more present when we have positive emotions. And what's important about that is it allows us to broaden what we consider and what we think about. Whereas when we are fleeing or fighting, understandably, our cognition tends to constrict and we tend to resort to threat, rigidity, patterns. We tend to regress to well-learned responses. In contrast, when we feel safe and social, we tend to be willing to take greater cognitive risks, explore new ideas, and listen to other people's ideas in a way that we might not in other situations. The build part of Barbara Fredrickson's work refers to the positive feedback loop in the sense of a virtuous cycle that builds upon itself. So when we have these positive associations in our own thinking, when we have these positive relationships based on that openness, it spirals upward and tends to anchor and build those capabilities within us, being a bit of an antidote to our usual negativity bias. So let me just give an example of this from my own work. I often work with simulation fellows who come to spend time with us, either in person or remotely, here at the Center for Medical Simulation. And I also have the privilege of working with some amazing colleagues here in Boston around the world in writing papers together. And often people thank me for mentoring them or having them be on a paper with me. And I'm very happy that they thank me for that. But I basically always laugh to myself because I feel like I am getting as much or more out of that work together than they are. I literally feel like I get to surf the energy that they bring to these things. I get to benefit and build and broaden my own thinking based on their cool new ideas. And the joy of our swirling our collective ideas together, to me, is a perfect example of this positive emotion and broaden and build. And they couldn't do what they do, I don't think, unless there was something we were doing collectively or together as a duet or a trio that was allowing us all to feel safe and social and bring our best selves to this conversation. So let's end by talking about how do we anchor? How do we strengthen? How do we, if I can use a mechanistic metaphor, install these habits of noticing the people, places, or situations that help us feel safe and social, those glimmers. And I'm going to do that using the work of Rick Hansen, who is a psychologist at the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California, Berkeley. And specifically his marvelous book, Resilient: How to Grow an Unshakable Core of Calm, Strength, and Happiness. lest that sounds hokey to you, let me just say what Rick Hansen does beautifully is synthesize reams of research, his own and others, into this process where we can strengthen these glimmers. And what he suggests is that we do something in 3 steps, which is have, enrich, and absorb these positive experiences. And in my opinion, he wisely counsels us to do this because generally, because of our negativity bias, that is, we constantly focus on what we mess up or what makes us feel bad so that we can avoid it, and or if you're like me, learn and grow from it, instead of focusing on the positives. And he says we tend to just blow right by those. And what's consequential about blowing past glimmers or well springs or refuges or things that make you broaden and build is that you lose that resource, that important source of fuel and refreshment that's there every day, but you tend to not see it. So what Rick Hansen counsels us to do, and I'm going to suggest we can try it out as our workout of the week here, is to notice those glimmers that make you feel safe and social. He calls them refuges. And he says, notice those moments in conversation when you feel relaxed, calm, joyful, happy, connected, any of these things. Notice those situations. They might be a flow type situation when you're playing music or you're doing a sport or you're knitting or quilting or walking in nature. I think of these things as well springs because I notice that when I spend time and give space for these positive things, I feel like I drank a sweet, fresh drink on a hot day when I really needed something and I was thirsty. So what Rick Hansen suggests is notice that you've had this experience. So have the experience. Then once you've had it, he suggests you enrich it. And the ways he suggests we can enrich it are lengthen it. So for example, sometimes I step out my front door and I happen to live on the edge of some conservation land here in Massachusetts. And I just have found myself pausing and noticing the leaves just susurrating in the wind or the dew reflecting on the grass. And so I just try to give that a little more time. You can intensify it is another way to enrich the experience. And a friend of mine taught me a couple of years ago that when you look at a tree or a bush, say, "Hi, friend." So I thought this was the weirdest idea ever when she first introduced it to me. But I've noticed that if I address a tree or a bush and think of it as my friend, it looks different. It's kind of more intense. And so intensifying is a thing we can do. Rick Hansen also suggests when you have a positive experience, you can freshen it. And he says our brains are novelty detectors and designed to learn from what's new and unexpected. So if you have a positive experience, if you kind of inquire of yourself, what's interesting about this? Why was it even positive? And then lastly, implicit in everything we're saying here, a way to enrich it is to just value it instead of blow right past it. So you have the positive experience, you enrich the positive experience, and then Hansen suggests that we absorb it. And I'm just going to talk about 2 ways that he suggests that. One is intention. So I think we all need to train ourselves to give more attention to positive experiences. And part of the way we can do that is to have the intention of letting it influence us. Consciously choose to take in that experience. And then the other thing he says is try to notice the reward implicit in the positive experience. So those stories that I told at the beginning of Charles Perry really, really listening to me, or my tennis coach at Windridge Tennis Camp just lobbing me or hitting me the balls in a way that was just perfect at the edge of my expertise, that let me just feel like a good tennis player and one who could get better. Noticing those and letting yourself feel the awesomeness of those moments. And Rick Hansen suggests that if we can do that, it helps two neurotransmitter systems, one related to dopamine and one related to neuroepinephrine, which can let us sort of anchor those more in our brain. So, wrapping up, our workout of the week this week is to notice those glimmers, people, places, situations that help you feel safe and social, connected, creative, any of those things. And use this have, enrich, absorb 3-step that Rick Hansen talks about. So the workout of the week is notice these glimmers and then enrich them by giving them some weight and allow them to absorb into you by noticing how rewarding they feel or intending to hold on to them in some way. This is the opposite of blowing past all these positive things, little tiny positive things that happen to us almost every day. This has been Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. Curious Now is produced by James Lipshaw and directed by him as well. If you've enjoyed these ideas about leadership, you might enjoy our Simulation Leadership Intensive in August 2026 or in April 2027. Or you might enjoy working with me in our leadership coaching service. If so, please reach out to me at info@harvardmedsim.org.